You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hi everybody, this is episode 16 of Social Europe podcast. I'm Henning Meyer, editor-in-chief of Social Europe. Today we bring to you a conversation on progress in a digital age. The digital age has seen unprecedented transformations to our public spaces with new media, new jobs and new opportunities. But how can we use digital tools to inform, invent and inspire a new era of government action? These are the questions that Eric Schmidt, the executive chairman of Alphabet, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, Nicholas Berggren, the president of the Berggren Institute, and Reshma Joujani, founder of Girls Who Code, discuss. The panel was moderated by Thomas Ilves, the president of Estonia. We would like to thank Canada 2020, the Center for American Progress and Policy Network for allowing us to bring this panel discussion to you as a Social Europe podcast.
Nicholas Berggren is the founder of the Berggren Institute, which has done wonderful work on improving understanding of the transformations that we face today, and we'll be doing far more of that. Eric Schmidt, immediately to, this is in alphabetical order here, immediately to my left, probably needs no introduction as chairman of Alphabet, like Prince, formerly known as Google, and I don't have to say anything else after that, I think. But one of the people in the digital IT field who has given considerable thought to what it all means for society at large. He's co-author with Jared Cohen of The New Digital Age, and I'm always happy to see when people who have done so much technologically actually think about where it's all heading. Reid Hoffman is founder of LinkedIn and has, I think, shown us what serious social media can be like, which is why I like it so much, and is, again, thought deeply about new institutional arrangements between companies. And then Reshma Joujani, who is the founder of Girls Who Code, and who also ran for Congress in 2010. And I hope that you will be able to actually talk about issues relating to what has clearly been a case in the STEM areas ever since science and technology, engineering and mathematics became something that people studied, which is the huge difference between number of boys who deal with so-called hard subjects and the number of girls. And well, let me just start off from there. I think one of the big issues that we will be facing, one of the very big issues, is how technology will disrupt governance, societies, and maybe I give it to Nicholas to start off on that, and then we'll proceed from there.
Okay. Well, in truth, I would say there are two sides, and you've proven, let's say, the sunny side of technology at work, even though you're not in a very sunny place in Estonia. But you've taken technology and made it work for citizens and for government. And I think that the challenge that I see is that technology is working for citizens. It is working to some extent for government, but there is a bridging issue. We can see around the world, especially the Western world, let's say, lack of trust in government. And I think government can be helped by technology, by importing all the capacity that technology gives itself to communicate and to be transparent vis-à-vis citizens. And that's what you've done in Estonia. The question that I don't think is resolved yet is that technology gives everyone a voice, which is wonderful. Everyone access to information, which is also wonderful. But who is federating all these voices? Who's helping to sort of navigate the discourse? If you have a leader who's strong, like you do here in Canada, and who is bringing people together, I think that's great. If you have chaos, as you do in many countries in Europe, where I come from, or in America, where I live, that becomes an issue for democracy, becomes an issue really for those who are meant to be governing. So you've managed to bridge the gap, and the question is, can it be done at a bigger scale in other countries? I hope so.
Well, one of the things that I would say is that we're talking right now and tend to talk only about sort of the developed world, which faces these issues at a level of sophistication that we don't see in much of the developing world. My last project was precisely to see how you could use digital technology to improve the developing world. And it's this world that cannot be left out of the discussion. It cannot be so that we look at all of the problems we face only in our part of, the developed economies. And here I see digitization has a huge positive effect. I'll leave it as there. I just, as a little promotion, say that people who are interested in that, the World Bank just put out this fat book, but you don't have to get it. You can download it for free, called Digital Dividends, but which shows how massively you can change for the better societies. The problem that I think we face here, in the developed world, is that what will it do to us when the already industrialized world will be facing this digital revolution sort of frontally, which I don't think it has yet. Maybe let Eric think about that.
I start every day with the presumption that a connected world is a better world. And I start from the argument that there are on the order of 2.5 billion people on the internet using smartphones. In the next 5 years or so, we're going to add another 5 billion, plus or minus. So we're going to get to almost all of the humans in the next 5 years on smartphones. And we tend to sort of say, oh, it's kind of a big deal. Well, if you're living on $1 a day, you have no textbooks, no entertainment, no way of understanding what your government is doing, no way to report crimes, no way to report the horrific treatment that you see, especially as a woman in these parts of the world, the arrival of the smartphone is more important than anything we have ever seen. And so let's start from the premise that that's going to happen. And I'm also going to argue that in the next few years, advances in artificial intelligence and computation power will make people smarter. I use Google every day, as I hope you all do, and because I can't remember all that stuff, but Google does. And I've sort of adapted to my daily life, right, that I look it up and I check what people say and so forth and so on. It makes me smarter. So the next advances in computation and algorithms, many of which we're pioneering here in Canada, by the way, are going to provide that. So I think for the next 5 to 10 years, it's a fully connected world. We're going to see all of the political leadership, all of the political problems come out because now everyone has a voice, and a lot of those voices are voices we haven't heard and we don't like, right? And all of these issues are going to come to the fore. And we shouldn't be surprised. People didn't know this stuff was happening, and now they do, right? We've gone from very few people knowing things to most people knowing most of what's going on with the aberrant effects that you see.
Reid, how do you, in your own work, connecting people in your way, how do you see developments in the next 5 years?
So I look a lot at this progress, and I plus one everything that Eric just said, as moving into the networked age. And so you actually have to be thinking in terms of networks. You think in any entity, whether it's you as a person, an organization, a government, as something that is actually, in fact, embedded in a networked world. And what that means is that you now, when you're kind of trying to figure out how to shape future events, how to build technologies that are positive for society, how to affect the influence of whether it's jobs or a healthy dialogue and governance, is how do you create that? And part of when you think about networks, you say, well, okay, what are nodes? What is identity? How do people communicate? How do you have messaging? How do you have trust of information? And those are the kinds of things that you think about as you say, how do we shape this in order to have a much more positive outcome? And I think one of the things that's a key is obviously because we've been in this massive, kind of mobile and internet revolution, we've got a lot of new things that we're discovering. There are things about it that we're like, well, that's not exactly the outcome we want. And so but it's a dynamic thing. We can shape it. And so, part of what I think happens is if any of us are acting as leaders, we have to think about how is it that we stimulate networks to congeal in a kind of, think of it as network density around the things that most matter. Is it entrepreneurship? Is it certain kinds of social activism or policies? Is it education? Is it CS education? And that's the pattern in which to think of these things. And so I think a connected world is much better. I think it comes with cost too, but I think it's the world is how we shape it.
Can I, Reed and I were talking about this before we walked on. I'm going to call this Reed's Law. If you want to make a change now, you've got to figure out a way to build a network and drive it online. So if you care about any of the things you're hearing about today, you've got to figure out a strategy using social networks with a message that will work, which will get people to act, right? I think that's your insight.
Exactly.
Now, one of the, I personally see one of the problems we have with our wonderful digital world is that it's a boys' club. It really is a boys' club. And so maybe we can ask Rashman how we can make it people, not just boys.
Well, I think it's, first of all, from a history point of view, some of the first pioneers of computer science were actually women, Ada Lovelace. And so you've really seen this decline of women since the 1980s, I would argue. People say that the 1980s is when the personal computer came out, and it was very much marketed as a toy for boys. And so a lot of male entrepreneurs will say, my parents bought me a computer when I was 12 years old, and boom, I took it apart and I thought about Facebook, right? So girls didn't have this transformative experience. And so in the 80s, about 40% of computer science majors in the United States were women. 40%. Really close to parity. Today, that number is less than 18%. So year by year by year, we've had a decline of women going into the field to build the products that are going to solve the solutions of today and tomorrow. And so what we do at my organization is really think about how do we develop and shape curriculum to really be targeted at girls. And I think one of the most unique opportunities that we have is actually girls want to change the world. 74% of high school girls in America say that when they think about a career, they're not dreaming about billion-dollar exits. They're dreaming about how they can solve problems that they're facing in their community. And so, Girls Who Code we've taught about 40,000 young women, and that's not just sprinkling a little hour of code here and there, but actually producing female software professionals. And so we're producing 40,000. We'll produce 100,000 next year. And only 10,000 women graduated in computer science. And so as I go across the country and I look at the problems that my girls are solving, it's Cora, who was 5 years old when her daddy got diagnosed with cancer. And she said, I want to be a doctor because I want to save my father's life. And so she built an algorithm to help detect whether a cancer is benign or malignant. Or it's Lucy and Maya, who were watching television one day and saw what was happening with lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan, and said, I want to do something about it. Or it's Jennifer, who saw what's happening with the Zika virus. And so in Austin, a group of girls came together and built a learning tool to help identify where Zika is going. And so I'm very concerned as a global citizen about, are we solving the problems of today and tomorrow? And the only way I believe that we're going to solve cancer, solve climate change, solve human trafficking, bullying, all these problems that many of us in this room are passionate about solving is if we give girls access to technology, because they are going to be the ones who solve it.
Well, I think part of the problem in the world is that we just don't have kids learning to code. I mean, I'm a real exception. Next year will be 50 years since I learned how to program in BASIC. I mean, it was very primitive and all that. But we really need to get our educational systems up to speed. I mean, I keep telling people that, coding is just like learning a foreign language, but there are no irregular verbs. It's just logic. And that's not hard. I mean, you can do that easily with 7-year-olds, and you will see the results. We started doing this in my own country. Well, it was my idea, but it's just to get all kids online. And 25 years ago, huge opposition that lasted years, because teachers they knew that kids would soon outpace them, and so forth. But now we see the effects 25 years later, where there are people 35, 40 years old who have great startups, or not even startups, and I ask them, where'd you start? And they go, well, I was in your program. I learned to code there. But we need to get this more broadly out there.
I know you like conflict, so can I push at you on this? I disagree. I think that as we think about getting computer science education for all, I think we have to draft policy with the mind of getting it to those who are underserved, which in my mind in the United States is women and people of color. And let me tell you why. So right now in the United States, 1 out of 10 American schools has high school. And if you're a woman, not the same case if you're a boy, if you have not taken computer science in high school, there's no way you're going to take it in college. And so when we as policymakers draft policy, we want wins. And so if in America there's only computer science in 1 out of 10 American schools, and there's only 1,500 computer science teachers in the country, and we have an administration or mayors announcing CS for all, who's going to get computer science education first? The wealthiest schools? The ones that have access to computers, that don't have connectivity issues? And so we need to think about how we get it to those who need it the most, and whose lives are going to be most transformed by it. And so what we're really pushing as we draft policy is to push our policymakers to actually pick the schools and the communities that are the most challenged and draft policy with an eye towards them. And so I just want to be careful, because again, I think that and I think we've seen this in many ways with some of our computer science initiatives, the pool's getting larger. There's actually more men today that are majoring in computer science because of some of these initiatives, and that means more men means less women, unfortunately. And so the gender gap has actually widened over the past 2 years.
Anyone want to take up that?
Well, so I think, Reshma, you make a good point. And Reid and Eric are clearly, through what they've done in terms of work, they've empowered many more people. The question is then translating the capacity of people to engage. All people, women, the ones who can afford it, the ones who cannot afford it, empowering everybody to be part of the digital society. And I'm sorry to put you, President Ilves, on the spot. You are a moderator, but maybe you can sort of address 2 very different issues. One, because I think we can all learn, frankly, what you've done in Estonia, because you've done it in a place that started challenged, quite poor, post-Soviet times, and has become, a very prosperous place compared to where it came from, in part thanks to technology. So you've done it, and you've given access really to everyone in a small place. The question is, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what actually is sort of technology at work for everyone.
Well, 25 years ago we were very poor and in a lot of trouble, and at least what I tried to do was convince people that our future would we would do rather well if we focused on education in technology, since we did have a strong base there, intellectual base there, and we had this neighbor across the Gulf, Finland, that was at that time a leading tech country, and that was the way to go. Clearly, I would say, I mean, I don't want to get into, we've done so much, it's hard to sum it up. So I'll just say, basically, you really have to focus on services for the citizen to get them online. Give them, first of all, access. So we built, before we had, people were poor, people didn't have computers. We built sites all over the country where you could go and use a computer. We put on a lot of government services that were far more efficient if you used the computer than if you did it on paper, far more transparent, which led to corruption reduction. And then in the long run, I mean, sort of things that people like, that work, that they will then use. We have digital prescriptions, which means that, virtually all prescriptions in my country are done digitally. So the doctor puts it into a computer, and you go to any pharmacy in the country and you put in your ID card, and then you get what you want. The people like these things. So if you offer services that people like, they will begin to use them more, and you reduce the friction of transactions across the board. What I will say, one thing we have learned is that without a secure identity, none of this will work. And I think that would be one of the challenges in the future, is how to create, what will become the standard for a secure identity? Because the model that we work on today, which is a email address and a single password, that worked fine in 1981 for a BitNet and 3,000 academics who are all more or less trustworthy. It doesn't work for 3 billion people. It just doesn't work. And all the horrible hacks that we've seen come from having, initially at least, a very weak identification system. And that I see as one thing where I think the government will have to be responsible to say, we stand by this identity. I won't get into the technology of it, but it certainly has to be two-factor identification. It has to be at a high level of sophistication. And that's what has enabled our system to work without any fundamental breakdowns in the past 16 years. Now, I'll go back to being a moderator. Eric, one of the things we've discussed before is that at least in those countries where we're at a high level of digital sophistication, one of the sort of dystopic visions of the future is that machines will do more and more, and it will take away jobs more and more. And we already see this happening somewhat, but with the rate of progress, or the accelerating rate, the exponential rate of what is happening with artificial intelligence, with algorithms that can do all kinds of things, with machine learning, that we may be facing a genuine hollowing out of not only the simplest jobs, but of the middle class.
So, I think everybody in the audience has seen all the movies where all this happens. And the good news is that the movies are probably not an accurate predictor of what will happen in the future. If you go back 20 years ago, we had exactly the same concerns about the automation of factories and so forth and so on. I can't speak for Canada, but in the United States, after all of the tremendous changes in the market and so forth, the United States is at a relatively low point of unemployment historically. So far the thesis that this dislocation eliminates jobs does not seem to be true. What is absolutely true is the jobs change, the nature of the jobs change, the way they work has changed, so forth and so on. And let me make you the optimistic argument, because all you'll hear is the movie-inspired negative arguments. We in our industry as a whole are trying to make consumers and people more intelligent, more useful, more knowledgeable, more entertained, more connected, right? How is that going to be bad for humanity? right? Now, if you're a critic of how people spend their time, I guess you could say it's a bad thing. But we're going to take the position that we are making people smarter, and that includes the most educated and also the least educated. And you can tell because people just flock to all these services. So I'm going to start with the presumption that at least for the short term, for the foreseeable planning future, that the technology that you all are using every day, the rapid adoption of smartphones and apps, on balance generates more jobs, although they are different jobs.
Anyone want to comment on that?
I think that there's a couple of things to add to that. So I think Eric's right in what he's saying in terms of the fact that technology can enable a whole bunch of new jobs, and it isn't like everyone has to become a software engineer. What I do think is that part of what happens is this landscape of industries change. It's part of the reason why entrepreneurship is even more important than it has been, both for individuals kind of creating their own jobs and also creating companies that create a bunch of jobs. And I think the way to think about that is no longer is kind of the industrial model by which, you went to school, you're 18 to 22, maybe 16, and you learned things and you're just going to apply that, kind of relatively mindlessly for the next 50 years, and that's going to be the skill set in terms of what you're doing. I actually think a continual learning approach, an ability to be entrepreneurial in terms of how you approach your own life and your own career, and thinking about that from institutions. Because to some degree, what work gets created is, we have an amount of human activity, and work gets created to fulfill needs for products and services, fulfill needs for entertainment, for time. And so those opportunities will still be there if they have changed shapes. And I think the key question here is not to try to kind of go, oh my gosh, technology is changing things, we should try to necessarily slow things down. Because actually I think we don't have that control. I don't think it's usually wise policy. It's much more, how do we help shape it in the path that we're taking to the future in order to have the right kinds of economic opportunities. And I think Reshma's earlier point about making sure that when you don't do, you say, well, this is, everyone should take CS, which I think is important. I think software is changing the world. I think everyone having some familiarity is useful. But to make sure that's not a code for, well, we'll first make sure all the men do it, and then we'll work on everyone else. That's a disastrous way of doing it. And so you got to make sure that you have inclusion in this future is key.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there's a real economic impact of doing that too. We're going to be releasing a study shortly where if you actually have parity in computer science jobs, you can add over $300 billion in women's earnings. And you can shrink the pay gap between men and women to 92 cents. And so there's real implications. My parents, my parents came here as refugees. And so my father would always say to me when I was growing up, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, because the income that I was going to bring to the family was meaningful. And so, I see so many of our girls, half my girls are under the poverty line, literally leaving homeless shelters, learning how to code, and then getting an internship at Google. And they're lifting their entire families up into the middle class. We have a huge, I think technology, from my perspective, has presented an enormous opportunity, an enormous economic opportunity.
This is not directly relevant to your point, which I completely agree with, but in the elites, the elite universities are seeing a huge increase in computer science enrollment. Princeton, the #1 major for undergraduates this year is computer science. Economics is number 2. 40% are female. So we are making some progress, at least there.
Going back to the issue of jobs, I think that any transition is hard and challenging and scary. But I think we just have to recognize the nature of jobs and the nature of occupations of the future is just going to be very different. And there was a time when people were mostly on farms, and they probably worked, 10 plus hours every day, 6 days a week. And if you had told them, well, listen, in a generation, you're going to be working only 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it would have looked quite scary. It would have looked like a decrease, not an increase. But the reality is that industry became a plus, not a minus. And I think that in the environment that we're in, we're going to change also, what does it mean to have a job? And it's very possible that people don't have one job. And what is the description of a job? So they may have 3 occupations. One of them may be a traditional-looking job, another one may be a consulting, another one may be being a volunteer, and they'll have occupations that are much more diverse, frankly, potentially more fulfilling and more attuned to being an individual as opposed to being, let's say, a member of a factory or member of a farming commune. So the transition is going to be hard, but the opportunities are, frankly, at the end, quite liberating.
We have less than 6 minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience that just to get a little audience participation? Otherwise, we could talk forever, probably. Microphones, anyone?
So I'm the CEO of an organization in Canada called Ace Tech Ontario, and our mandate is to help scaling technology companies grow from small companies into billion-dollar companies, and really trying now as a new agenda to advance women in tech. So I'll ask you on this panel, particularly after the incredible panel we just had and questions from Tina, we have to step it up in the media and generally in the world of business, but from your perspective in the digital economy, how can we advance women into leadership positions, even if they don't have a background in technology, we could use their skill set outside what you might have done that has been useful in your companies?
I give a couple of examples from Google. When we started, we were looking at our recruitment, and we found that the men would score women differently than they would score men. There's an unconscious bias. And that we studied whether the predictions of their success were correct. For men, their predictions were correct. For women, they were inversely correlated. They were actually exactly wrong. Evidence of clear and unconscious bias in what is essentially a liberal corporation. So we then we worked on that for a while, and I think we've addressed that pretty well. The next problem we have is that women were still underpaid on the same benchmarks. So long conversation. And it turns out the reason they were underpaid was that they entered the company underpaid, and we would set their salary based on their previous salary. So we changed our policies so that women were paid a market wage as we determined it, independent of their previous salary, which appears mathematically to eliminate the gap as best we can measure these things. And we have 65,000 people, so we can measure these things reasonably accurately now. So I think if you have enough science and you look at your outcomes and you have a big enough company, you can begin to mitigate the bad examples, right, with some progress.
And a related but slight shift to industry, in venture capital in Silicon Valley, it's much worse than it is in the tech companies. And that says something. And so what we did at Greylock is we decided that as a partnership that we would not rest until we hired a female partner. And we basically listed every single person that we considered as possible. And we all went out and started interviewing and recruiting and everything else. And so that was in our 52nd year as a firm, we hired the first woman partner. But you just have to make it an organizational priority.
Just to add, because we talked about what to do here in Canada, Girls Who Code wouldn't exist if it wasn't for companies like Google. 90% of our funding comes from corporates. We have every single technology company you can think of supports us and very much sees our work not as charity but a partnership, because I think they desperately want to build the pipeline too and recognize that you have to start as young as possible. So I really believe that corporates are allies in this movement.
Okay, we have a thing here that says hard stop, 4 minutes remaining, closing remarks. So, start with Nicholas.
Yeah, closing remarks. I think, it's obvious. Technology is there. It's not going away. It's going to empower everyone. So let's just make sure that it does empower everyone. Women, men, young people, older people, people who have privilege or not. And I do think that companies make it available. Government has to make sure that it is being used and used, for citizens, but also at the government level to bridge the gap between those two. The question that still remains is how do jobs become sort of modern jobs? I think the transition won't be easy, but I think Eric is right. At the end of the day, new jobs get created jobs that you have no idea exist will exist in 5 or 10 years. So I think that'll happen. I think that in that transition, it'll be hard for politicians to communicate with citizens in a way that's inspiring. You can see that in a lot of Western countries where fear seems to be winning against, a hopeful future. And that is almost the riskiest part of this transition, is that citizens just react and don't, embrace the potential, but react in fear. So leadership and examples like what has happened in Estonia and other places, I think, are really important.
Yeah, I think Tina mentioned this in her talk, and Eric did too. There's been a ton of progress. I believe that the future is bright, and that we're embarking on a movement here that's really focused on how to get girls access to technical education, how to get minorities and underserved communities access, and we're making change. And I think, I feel always so blessed to be able to go to work every day because, I feel like there's few times in your life where you feel like, wow, you're really making a difference. And I can see the gap closing every single day. And so I just hope that we take advantage of this opportunity. We can do it in the next 10 years. And that as we're drafting policy, we're thinking about making sure that we don't leave anyone behind.
Just to repeat, we live in a networked age. If you want to create something of scale or persistence, how do you deploy and shape networks?
This whole conference, the reason we're all here today for the whole day, is around essentially a consensus about how society should be organized. And I'm going to broadly call them liberal Canadian values. Equal treatment, equal opportunity, advancement for women, a knowledge economy, these kinds of things. I suspect we all agree on that. The question that I don't understand is the collision between those values and the reality of governance. It's not something I understand. You have done very, very well, of course. But I worry that the collision of our sort of liberal values collides with the fact that governments often exist for other reasons, including economic rents, benefiting the elites, traditional values, so forth and so on. And that contest is the contest of the ages. And I think trying to figure out the best practices to get, what I'm going to say broadly, these liberal values through without huge violence in the streets, and I mean that seriously, is crucial, right? Society has moved forward. If you go back to the treatment of minorities, the treatment of women, the treatment of children, and so forth, the work week, over 100 years, there's been huge advancement. So this is just another step in the advancement of modern society to make it safer, more thoughtful, more liberal, and so forth and so on. But we don't yet have a plan as to how to do that in a uniform way, in a way that works globally, that causes us to be able to be successful.
Okay, if I would say, I won't get it, I didn't get into it because it's too short a time, but I would say if there's one group that's even less or more underrepresented than women in tech, and that are politicians who understand the basic essentials of technology. But this is, I didn't mean that as a joke. I mean that since so much, and this is what we found with the World Bank report, of progress does not depend on technology itself, because the technology is universal. The problem is that do people in parliaments, do people in governments understand what something is? If, as I found out, a leading politician did not know what 2 to the third was when I talked about Moore's law, then we are in trouble, because that person will be part of the group determining the future of policy regarding IT. So I would say that minority really has to change as well. We need politicians who have a clue about what they're talking about.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.